So, the Cold War, its origins, its key moments we're going to explore, its cultural impact. Broadly speaking, just so you have the chronological bookends of when the Cold War takes place, it's basically the end of World War II through the early 1990s. The Cold War is not, I repeat, not going on anymore. Now, there are tensions between the US and Russia, but the Cold War is something specific to this time period. It's specific to the Soviet Union, which was a different entity, and communism and a number of other variables as well. So, let me give you a quick overview of its origins. The US and the Soviet Union, if we were to go back to the end of World War II, they're the only superpowers. They're the only real nations left standing at the end of the conflict. The British Empire is a shell of what it once was. Yes, they have colonies overseas, but they can't maintain them. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. France had been defeated. The French Empire is scattered to the wind. The German Empire, as it was under Hitler's Third Reich, is destroyed. All of the other Western European colonial powers are nothing to what they were. The US and the Soviet Union are the chief victors at the end of the war. And it's important to realize that if you were to look at the map of how Nazi Germany was defeated, the US and Britain close in from the west, the Soviet Union closes in from the east. The Soviet Union in May of 1945, they're in command of half of Europe. They control all of Eastern Europe. All of the people in countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, are all under the grip of the Soviet military. You saw the end of Schindler's List. It's the Soviet Union that liberates Schindler's Jews. They're also in command of a good chunk of Germany. And ultimately what the victorious Allies decide on how to end the Second World War is that Germany needs to be divided. This is a plan that's somewhat in flux and not everybody agrees, but it's sort of the least common denominator thing that all of the people, US, Britain, Soviet Union, can agree partially on. And what they decide is that the western part of Germany, that was in command of the US and the British, will be under the control and supervision of the Western powers. US, Britain, France, some others as well. The eastern part of Germany will go to the administration and supervision of the Soviet Union. Remember, they had spent the millions of lives defeating Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union spends 100,000 lives just alone to take the city of Berlin. 100,000 plus lives. Berlin, because it's the capital city, and under this new arrangement, Germany's divided, they decide to divide the capital city. So the Soviets get half of Berlin, and the Western powers get half of Berlin. And that's really awkward because Berlin is deep in the heart of the Soviet chunk of territory. So in order to get to your outpost in Berlin, you have to cross over Soviet airspace and territory. At one point in the late 1940s, because there was tension over how this was going to be managed, Berlin as a city is going to be closed off. The Soviet Union is going to disallow, it's going to stop access to the city of Berlin. And this is a problem because you have land corridors and you have air corridors. And if you shut down the land corridors, the only way to get supplies to West Berlin, if you're the US or Britain or France, is to fly them in. So there's going to be this period in 1948-49 called the Berlin blockade/airlift, where the US and the Western powers, mainly the US, is going to keep West Berlin afloat solely on supplies that can be brought from the air. This is an image from the time, kind of advertising the power of aviation here, which is that the U.S., through its commercial and economic might, can supply the German people, who are now kind of rehabilitated into this heroic picture, and maintain this outpost of democracy in the face of Soviet communism. At one point during the airlift, this statistic always amazes me because it's the power of the logistics and economics of the Western world and the United States, a plane is taking off with cargo or landing every 30 seconds. Planes loaded down with everything from coal to baby formula are going to be operating. That's an amazing testament to their commercial power. So here's what Germany looks like if you want a visualization. The Western zone, in orange, you have an area that's administered by the Americans initially. This is going to have, like, the city of Munich involved. There's going to be a number of U.S. air and military bases here in the south. The French are going to get this borderland region here with their own country. They're going to administer that. The British are going to get the green sector up there in the north, although the U.S. is going to control the strategic port of Hamburg. And the Soviets are going to control the red, creatively labeled. Glad 3 people got that. The eastern portion. But Berlin is uniquely situated in the eastern sector. So it means if you want access to it, you have to fly or go by rail car. There's not exactly a clean movement of traffic into the Soviet sector. Initially you can. It gets more restrictive as time goes on. Here it is. And ultimately, these administrative zones, they get merged together in their own separate, they create separate countries. Germany gets divided into 2 countries. In the West, the British, the French, the Americans merge their zones together. For a while they call it Trizonia. And then they merge it together and they create what's known as the Federal Republic of Germany. This is capitalist, free market democracy. It is very similar to kind of the basic principles of how the U.S. Wants to operate. Private property, there's no communism, there's no command economy really. And that's going to be its own separate country, and it's going to be heavily supervised and supported by the United States. It's like the one area of Europe, it's one of the many areas of the world that the U.S. wants to maintain its strength because it's an outpost for freedom, democracy, and capitalism as they would see it. The Soviet Union merges their eastern sector into what's called the German Democratic Republic, the DDR, which is commonly going to be known as East Germany. And that's how it's going to look until 1990. Berlin's going to similarly be divided on the inside, so you do have this outpost where the U.S., the British, and the French, the Western powers, can get access to Berlin. A number of U.S. presidents are going to go there. There's a lot of opportunity for kind of political grandstanding. Kennedy's going to go there, give a big speech. Reagan's later going to go there, give a big speech as well. If you pan out and you look at the big geostrategic picture, this is what Europe looks like in the onset of the Cold War. The capitalist Western democracies are going to be kind of unified in blue, as you see here. Great Britain, France, Italy, West Germany. West Germany is the key point that borders with the Soviet Union in East Germany. Conversely, the Soviet Union is going to form its own bloc of nations, and all of these nations are going to have communist governments to one degree or another, under the supervision and support of the Soviet Union. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and then the Soviet Union proper. You're going to have some other countries like Yugoslavia, which are communist themselves, but they're not allied to Soviet communism, and they kind of do things differently. Some other countries like Austria and Sweden and Finland are going to try to go a third direction of non-allied, not siding with either. Spain is going to be an interesting choice. They're going to have a dictator there who somehow survives World War II. His name is Francisco Franco. He's going to live into the 1970s. He's going to loosely ally himself with the West in the United States, but that's not going to be very clear early on. So one of the reasons we look at history is to examine perspective and to build empathy. So I'm going to try to present for you how the U.S. and the Soviet Union see each other in the immediate years following the Second World War. And I think this is kind of interesting to do, because oftentimes when we look at sort of the political contest of the Cold War, we often don't get back to these first principles of how each side began to perceive each other, and then where those initial mindsets led to. So, Soviet Union, what do they think? Well, they'd be very quick to point out that they did most of the fighting and heavy lifting against Nazi Germany. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, it's the Soviet Union that has to do something about it. The U.S., the British, they're not going to set foot in Europe until the summer of 1943 in the invasion of Italy, and it's not going to be for another year until the D-Day landings in 1944. So from the Soviet perspective, they matched Nazi Germany bullet for bullet, man for man, square mile for square mile, house by house. They did everything related to the tough slog that had to be inflicted upon Nazi Germany. And as a consequence, they feel pretty darn justified about their control of Eastern Europe. When they set up a communist government in Poland, and when they station troops there, or when they take parts of a factory apart and send it back to the Soviet Union, they feel absolutely justified because this is their just desert for winning World War II. And they would be the first to point out that they did more of the heavy lifting. They fear encirclement by the capitalist democracies. They look at the United States and Great Britain in the late 1940s and they say, you're surrounding us. You have been at war with us since our inception, when we had the Russian Revolution and when the Bolshevik communists prevailed against all odds. When the white armies were sent in to destroy us in our infancy, we prevailed. When the U.S. and others cut off diplomatic ties and refused to trade with us in the 1920s and 30s, we prevailed. And when Nazi Germany, who pledged to wipe communism off the face of the earth, attacked us in 1941, we prevailed. And now that the war is over, yes, we cooperated with the capitalist West to defeat Nazi Germany, but we're still fearful that you're out to get us because you've been out against our system from the get-go. And they also feel justified in promoting global communism. Meaning if there are people around the world in Asia or Latin America or Africa that want to have a communist-type political economic system that's not capitalism, they feel totally justified to send them supplies and resources and even send military advisors. Remember, they see capitalism as inherently exploitative. You guys remember rock, paper, scissors, Karl Marx. You remember that lab. Capitalism to the Soviet Union, to people who believe in the tenets of Marxism, it exploits workers. It oppresses. This is something that should be undone. We need to arrive to a new plane of existence where people can more better thrive. What does the United States think? Well, they're largely untouched by war and they have nuclear weapons. If you're a farmer in Iowa, your life hasn't been disrupted like, say, a Ukrainian peasant. If you're a dock worker in San Francisco or New York, your life is a little bit different than, say, a dock worker in parts of the Soviet Union or a factory worker in parts of central Poland. So the U.S. is able to look at the world with kind of fresh eyes and optimism and a can-do spirit that maybe the Soviets don't have. They're distrustful of Soviet intentions. They don't know what Joseph Stalin is capable of. There are some people who think that they know, but they've seen him kind of put communist governments in charge in Eastern Europe. They've seen him kind of push the boundaries of communism elsewhere. They know he did a lot of nasty stuff in his own country. The U.S. feels justified in promoting capitalism. They wouldn't phrase it maybe that way. They'd say, we believe in free markets. We believe that people should have the right to own private property. We believe that things like mineral rights should be commodities that you should have private companies go mine for and use, and that farmers should be able to own land, and that they should be able to sell their produce for a profit, and that's capitalism, that's markets. That's the system we believe in, and we're going to go to the mat to defend it. And finally, they're uncertain about how much to commit to the future safety of Europe. Initially, and traditionally, the U.S. held the belief that you mobilize for war, you build up the guns and the ships and the tanks, and you fight the war, and you demobilize for peace. That had been the tradition. Not so after World War II, at least not long term. After World War II, the threat of communism, it's so real and so vast, the U.S. has to figure out, maybe we should maintain a permanent military, a navy, an air force, and we should have bases in places like Germany and England and Italy, and we should have a navy that patrols the Mediterranean Sea nonstop, and we should probably have an Atlantic Navy and a Pacific Navy, and these should just be permanent things. That's a new concept. You had to kind of coach people up and educate them on why that's needed. Okay, so let these perspectives simmer, and this is where we're going to do kind of a breakout activity. One of the people who really tried to get their minds around how to behave towards the Soviet Union was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, whose name is George Kennan at the time. George Kennan was the ambassador living in Moscow, and he sent a letter, a telegram, because you couldn't fire off an email back then, back to the United States in February 1946. So it's kind of like his first take on what the Cold War was starting to look like. They wouldn't even have used the term Cold War at the time, But Kennan sends back a very interesting telegram. It's kind of a key artifact to U.S. thinking at the time. And this is his take on the Soviet Union. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to listen and just kind of soak it in. And with a partner who's seated next to you, there should be a number you want to gather around, two people, three at most, depending on where the card is located. You're going to be converting this longer piece of text into one sentence. That's all you have to do. And that one sentence, I want you to write it down. It should convey, what is he trying to communicate? What's an essential sentence that communicates what Kennan wants the U.S. planners back in Washington to know about the Soviet Union? Write it down. You'll notice there's a number on your card. I'm going to call at people at random to ask me to read their sentence. And hopefully, we can get a variety of different takes to explore that issue. Soviet power, unlike that of Hitlerite Germany, is neither schematic nor adventuristic. It does not work by fixed plans. It does not take unnecessary risks. Impervious to logic and reason, it's highly sensitive to the logic of force, meaning it responds to the military. If situations are properly handled, there need be no prestige-engaging showdowns. Gauged against the Western world as a whole, Soviets are still, by far, the weaker force. Thus, their success will really depend on the degree of cohesion, meaning holding together, firmness and vigor which the Western world can muster. Much depends on health and vigor of our own society. Here's my favorite line. World communism is like a malignant parasite, which feeds only on diseased tissue. We must formulate and put forward for other nations a much more positive and constructive picture of the sort of world we would like to see than have put forward in the past. Meaning, we haven't done this in the past. We haven't really sang the praises of democracy and tried to get other nations to sing along with us. Many foreign peoples in Europe, at least, are tired and frightened by the experiences of the past, meaning war, and are less interested in abstract freedom than just security. They're seeking guidance rather than responsibilities. We should be better able than the Russians to give them this, and unless we do, the Russians certainly will. Take 2 minutes with your partner or group of three. Construct a sentence that conveys what Kennan is trying to communicate to Washington. All right, we're live here. So, after Kennan makes that argument, guess what? He was an educated fellow and he was pretty persuasive in that long telegram. The U.S. adopts a lot of the ideas that would put his long telegram ideas into effect. So, strategy and policy, how does the Cold War take shape? Well, the U.S. it embarks upon this long, big meta-strategy known as containment. Containment basically means this. Limit the spread of communism and fund anti-communist movements where you can. Stop it from spreading. Do what you can to undermine it where it seems like it's at risk of maybe growing. It's pretty general, easy to get your mind around concept. The real question is, how do you implement it, and under what circumstances do you implement containment? So, one thing they do is they kind of band a bunch of the capitalist democracies in North America and Western Europe together into a grand alliance known as NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's kind of a band of capitalist democracies who pledge that if one is attacked, they're all attacked, and it's kind of a mutual defense treaty. Here's an image of it. Looks like this. U.S., Western European powers, some of these will come and go over the years. Canada will be tacked on for good measure. Turkey's going to be a real strategic outpost as well in the Mediterranean. And later on, NATO's still a thing, by the way. Since the end of the Soviet Union, when it ceased to exist in the early 1990s and the Cold War ended, the U.S. kept expanding NATO. It's one of the top 3 things the Russians today really dislike about the United States is that we continue to spread NATO and add people to it to surround them. There are a lot of other things the Russians have issues with. That's one of them. So, where does this take place, this idea of containment? First, the first kind of real case in point, aha, here example, It's called the Truman Doctrine. In 1947, there's a communist movement in Greece. There's also an anti-communist movement in Greece. Greece is a strategic outpost in the Mediterranean. It would be really bad if this fell to communism. So President at the time, Harry Truman, decides to ask Congress for an aid package, money, and supplies to be given to these anti-communist forces in Greece. This becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. Pretty much every president in the Cold War afterwards will pretty much adhere to this, which is, if you got an anti-communist group somewhere on the globe that needs guns, we give them. That's the idea. And not just guns, money. We'll send advisors. We'll maybe take out some of their enemies through secret assassinations, and a whole list of other things. The Marshall Plan. It's kind of the economic arm of containment, which is the core of those anti-communist nations. It's Western Europe. It's Britain. It's France. It's Italy. It's West Germany. Those need to be strong, vibrant pillars of democracy, if I'm reading Kennan correctly. Meaning, if you just let those nations that experienced World War II kind of fall into the ashes, first of all, there might be a communist revolution that takes over in one of those countries. That would be really bad. But also, they're not going to be able to be willing to really help you unless you do something to help them. So the Marshall Plan, named for the Secretary of State at the time, he was also the Chief of Staff of the Army in World War II, George C. Marshall, he advocates a major economic aid program to rebuild Europe. Particularly Western Europe. It's offered to Europe as a whole, but a lot of the Eastern European nations opt out of it because it's seen as sort of a sinister capitalist plot. And in some ways, it kind of binds all of these nations together on the side of the U.S. They're writing the checks to rebuild their society. So Britain, France, Italy, Germany are all going to benefit from this Marshall Aid package. And there are some other benefits. It's not just about doing the anti-communist thing. It's also, you rebuild their countries, they're going to become consumers. They're going to want to buy U.S. goods. That means when they rebuild their own militaries, they're going to want to buy U.S. tanks and armaments and guns, and they're going to want the consumer goods from the West. When their wealthy and middle-class populations rebound, they're going to want to buy U.S. designer clothes. They're going to want to buy U.S. Gadgets and other consumer goods that are kind of a sign that you've made it into the middle class. And there's less of a chance of communism. Mutual assured destruction, this is the idea that since the U.S. and the Soviet Union both have nuclear weapons, by the 1950s, this is very clear. These nuclear weapons are advancing and becoming vaster. They're being outfitted on missiles. They're being put on submarines and spread all throughout the globe. It pretty much becomes clear that nobody wants to fire the first shot. So a key pillar in U.S. national security becomes, we won't fire the first shot because we know the other side will fire a shot. And in a nuclear war, there really are no winners. So we both can be mutually assured that we'll be destroying our societies and the societies of other people if we engage in the use of nuclear weapons. And this is a stabilizing force. It's an uncomfortable force, but it's a stabilizing one. The U.S. also begins to adopt a belief and a greater adherence to this thing called domino theory. The idea that the world is a layout of dominoes. Each nation is its own separate domino. And you have to be able to go to the mat to defend capitalism and democracy, because if that domino should fall, it will cause other dominoes to fall to communism. So you see this cartoon here of Uncle Sam propping up the South Vietnam domino. That's a case-in-point example. We're going to talk about this in a bit, but the Vietnam War is a case-in-point example of the Cold War in action. You got to keep seemingly insignificant parts of the world open to markets and democracy and capitalism. Otherwise, other weaker nations will not feel the impulse to stand up. And that's kind of the idea behind domino theory. They're going to engage in a big propaganda campaign. Some of this is kind of humorous for today's eyes. One of the elements of this propaganda or information at the time is going to be what's called Radio Free Europe. Essentially, you can put radio transmitters all throughout Western Europe, France, England, and so forth, and it can transmit radio messages, terrestrial radio, to the people behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Soviet communist wall, so to speak. And they can hear these messages about why the West is actually great and the U.S. is all about freedom and democracy and you should really do what you can to limit the spread of communism and so on. And they would raise money for Radio Free Europe from the public. And this is an ad. Sure, I want to fight communism, but how? You mean I can fight communism? Yes, you can for your donation. And that's one element of this. Some other elements you could witness in popular culture. Your tomorrow may depend on today's preparedness. Further information, contact your county extension or civil defense office. At the most local level, the idea of the Cold War as a thing that you needed to be able to react to, the idea that the specter of war was hanging over you at every moment through fallout shelters. If you go in old buildings, you can see that symbol that this building is equipped with a fallout shelter. How many of you, who were all born after the Cold War, have seen this symbol before? Okay, yeah, it's around. It's still a thing. More for Radio Free Europe, the idea of using the idea that you have to protect children from communist propaganda. So the West has their propaganda. The East, Soviet communism, has theirs. Oftentimes, this is just a snapshot of some of them. The West is going to be portrayed, the capitalist U.S. West is going to be portrayed in this stereotypical way of the top hat, the three-piece suit. In this case, the guy has it red, white, and blue, star-spangled flag, three-piece suit. And he's always trying to kind of encircle or trick the communist world in some sort of way, almost in a way of like undermining their virtue. And the way the communist world would often see this and portray this was that the capitalist West is really good at creating gadgets and little meaningless, hollow, soulless consumer goods that dazzle us. But we're embarking on a much more virtuous society that looks out for everyone, that's stronger. So Soviet propaganda is often going to show these very muscular, square-jawed industrial laborers who work with their hands and are proud of it, rejecting the temptation of the capitalist West. And then ultimately this would pay off, that Soviet production and industrialization will pay off. So, I'm going to give you a kind of splash of key moments in the Cold War. If you were to go back to the early 1950s, this would seem like a really dark hour for the United States, not because the United States is weak, but it just doesn't seem to be all that successful in stopping the spread of communism. It's one failure after another. There's a revolution in China. A communist revolution succeeds in China. This is a huge deal. It's the largest country outside the Soviet Union. Communist leader Mao Zedong and his band of communists beat all the odds, succeed against all sorts of problems thrown at them, and they defeat the U.S.-backed Chinese nationalists. The U.S. had given the nationalists money, military advisors, equipment, support. The communists defeat them, and they drive them to Taiwan. In this case, the U.S. cuts off all diplomatic relations with China. They try to kind of shun them from the international community. The Soviet Union, of course, loves the idea. It looks like communism is on the march. It's not only succeeding in the Soviet Union, it's happening in Eastern Europe. There are communist movements in Africa, the Middle East, and now China. This is the wave of the future. And then, Korea. The Korean Peninsula, rather, had been divided at the end of World War II. There had been a sort of communist-friendly government installed in the north, a non-communist government in the south, and then in the summer of 1950, the North communist sector invades the south. It's supported loosely by the Russians and the Chinese, but not officially. And it almost succeeds. The Korean War is a war between the non-communist South Koreans and the communist North Koreans. The Chinese will eventually intervene on behalf of the North Koreans. The U.S. and the United Nations will intervene on behalf of the South. So I'm going to give you the Korean War in 30 seconds here. Basically, initially, it looks like a tremendous sweeping victory for the North Koreans. The U.S. intervenes at like the last moment they could to hold off the defeat of the South. They do this risky invasion at the port of Incheon, kind of catches the North Koreans off guard. And it seems as though the peninsulas will be divided again. The North Koreans are pushed back, but the U.S. sort of overplays its hand. It invades further north. It tries to destroy all of the North Korean army. And that triggers newly formed Communist China to enter the war. It's a much more contested situation then, and the U.S. ultimately settles for an armistice in 1953, which is the armistice we have today. North Korea's been in the news a lot. Kim Jong-un, you guys have probably seen him. He's the grandson of Kim Il-sung, the leader of the North Koreans who fought during the Korean War and created the state that is North Korea at the time. So, early 1950s, if you're a U.S. observer and you're looking to contain the spread of communism, this is not a pretty picture. Joseph Stalin, head of the Soviet Union, he's going to die in 1952, and he'll be replaced by another individual. Mao Zedong, leader of the communists, they're going to, on paper, look like they're Team Communism. And they're really powerful. They have a lot of industrial might behind them. They have nuclear weapons. Russia has it in 1949. Communist China is going to get nuclear weapons in 1964. This seems, for the moment, to be a unified front. If you look at Europe, things are going from bad to worse there. In Berlin, that all-important strategic outpost for the capitalist democracies, the Soviets decide to make life difficult and humiliating by building a wall to separate that. So, I'm going to give you a splash here of key events in the Cold War. This one instance, I only bring it out not because it had really long-term significance, but at the time, it really crystallized for people the stakes of the game, of the Cold War. It's called the Kitchen Debate. In 1959, I don't have time to show you the clip, U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon, he was Eisenhower's vice president, he travels to Moscow to a World Fair type exhibit where the Soviet Union is going to lay out its best stuff, it's all of its techno gadgets, new modern living sort of thing. Color TVs are a new thing at that time. The U.S. is going to bring out its best stuff. It's going to be like a parade of homes for capitalism and communism. And they walk through these exhibits together. Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, Vice President Richard Nixon, and Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, seizes this as an opportunity to start just ripping capitalism up and down. He points out the fact that the U.S. were slow to set up their displays and that there was still stuff unattended. Vice President Nixon tries to kind of defend it, and Khrushchev goes into this long rant that Soviet communism is still new. We've only been around for 40 years, but we're eventually going to surpass the West. This was a real confidence on the part of Soviet communism, was that capitalism was weak, capitalism was exploitative, and that given time, Soviet communism was going to overwhelm them. And a lot of people in the West kind of thought, yeah, that could be the case. In 1961, there's an attempt to have an anti-communist revolution in Cuba. There had been a successful communist revolution in 1959. The U.S. tried to supply anti-communist forces with the weapons and manpower to overwhelm the Castro regime in Cuba. It fails epically. It's a big humiliation. Castro defeats it. The U.S. looks weak and humiliated. And as a result, a lot of people in the U.S. and in the West start to question the extent to which capitalism and democracy can prevail. The Berlin Wall we talked about is created in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis. You guys explored this in the U.S. too, so I won't belabor the point. It's kind of the moment of maximum danger in the Cold War. It's where those nuclear weapons were almost used. The U.S. and the Soviet Union get into a contest of how do we get out of a situation where we both have to look strong and powerful to our respective people, but neither of us wants to back down and look weak. The Soviet Union had put missiles in Cuba, faced them at the United States. They liked the idea of that. The U.S., for its part, needed to get those missiles out and look like it was retaining its self-respect. And at the end, both sides kind of came to an agreement where the Soviets would withdraw, the U.S. would kind of scale back some of its commitments, and it was peacefully war was averted. But it was a moment of real crisis. The Vietnam War, kind of your biggest long-term example of the Cold War in action, and more importantly, it's an example of how far the U.S. was willing to go to carry out that mission of containment, to stop the spread of communism. If you're looking for a spot to make sure the dominoes don't fall and make sure communism doesn't succeed, you're going to have to go to parts of the world where it doesn't seem to be very consequential. So I want to show you this clip here, the sound is working, from an HBO movie came out a number of years ago called Path to War. has some pretty big-name actors. The British actor Michael Gambon plays Lyndon Johnson, president in 1964 at the time that he was evaluating whether or not to commit lots of U.S. forces to Vietnam. And the sort of older actor Donald Sutherland, it plays one of LBJ's advisors, Clark Clifford. And the actor Alec Baldwin plays Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. Both advisors are going to have a moment where they have Johnson's ear. And they're arguing why it makes sense or why it doesn't make sense to commit to the Vietnam War, to support anti-communist forces. And I want you to listen to that, and based on what they knew at the time, based on the argument that's given to Johnson, I want you to evaluate what you decide. With two other quick slides. The Cold War in culture. Fallout shelters, we know, are a thing during this period. There was a big push within things like Life magazine and Time magazines and Sears catalogs and other places to offer people the chance to keep themselves safe by building a fallout shelter in their own backyard. This is a very kind of middle-class idea thing you could do, a home construction project to make people kind of cope with the idea that nuclear war was a possibility. And, you know, it can be done in a real tasteful way where you have tile floors and a record player and a nice comfy couch and, you know, pantries full of canned food, and it can be quite pleasant. So fallout shelters were a big part of that. I want to show you just a quick picture here. This is an image from Popular Science magazine. Even they're getting in on it. How to build a family foxhole. Russian guns, how good. So that's really gripping. It gets down to the little kid level. You guys probably explored this in US too. Bert the Turtle, the cartoon character designed to coach up 6, 7-year-old kids that in the event of a nuclear war or a drill, you get under the desk, duck and cover. That's the drill. It's humorously absurd, but what it does is it shows us this touches the most innocent, vulnerable members of society, and you deal with it on a daily basis. The space race. This is a big contest because the exploration of space is a testament to how vigorous and advanced your society is when it comes to technology, the final frontier. The Soviets are going to be first into space in April 1961. The U.S. will follow shortly after. It's believed at the time that the Soviets kind of get a jump when it comes to rocket technology. Later on, the U.S. space program and the hundreds of billions of dollars it pours into it will eventually get the U.S. to the moon and, I guess, quote-unquote, win the space race. The interstate highway system is a product of the Cold War. If you were to try to drive across the country in the 1940s, it would have taken you many weeks because it's a constellation of small country, local, county highways that take you all over the place. There is no direct route. That was built expressly for the purpose of moving military equipment if you had to in the event of a war. Hollywood films, I don't have time to show it to you, but very famous films. The entire James Bond 007 series is set with the backdrop of the Cold War. You have numbers of other movies. How many of you have seen the Rocky movies? Okay, Rocky IV is the one that everybody seems to remember. Even into the 1980s, this was a very gripping, compelling storyline that film producers rallied around. Cities were outfitted with fallout shelters. Civil defense was a big deal. These kind of posters that you could find in any city in the world. The space race in action, Time magazine, Race for the Moon, Russians first in space. The highways, we've still got 2-3 minutes, so please don't pack up early. Being created. Final slide, and just jot down a few of the key points here. This is just sort of a wrap-up to the narrative. So where does the Cold War end? After kind of that really tense moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's kind of a slow improvement, gradual. If you're watching it day to day, you might not notice it, but if you're watching it in retrospect, there is a change. By the late 60s, early 1970s, even though the U.S. is like in the midst of the Vietnam War, it takes actions to sort of simmer down the tensions with the Soviet Union. In the early 1970s, the Nixon administration is going to open up diplomatic relations with Communist China. This serves a couple purposes. On one hand, it scares the Soviets because the U.S. is now becoming buddy-buddy with their chief ally, communist partner, and that looks bad for them. So the U.S. tries to exploit that division in the communist world. So Nixon famously travels to China here, At the same time, in the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet economy is hitting some real rough patches. They're not creating the consumer goods that they thought they'd be producing. They're really good about steel and rail car and industrial technology, but they're not creating the new techno-gadgets and microchips that are going to characterize the next technological revolution. So there are a number of problems and reforms that they tried to sort out in the 1980s, and as a result, during this time, increased openness, they've got 30 seconds, will lead to the Soviet Union kind of unraveling really quickly. Between the 1989-1991 period, it's going to collapse. It's going to lose its grip on Eastern Europe. And in 1991, the Soviet Union is going to cease to exist and become the Russian Federation. That's all I got for now. We barely kept the wheels on towards the end, but we got there.